On the morning of March the 14th, 1896, in the established and respectable district of Philadelphia, where cobblestones still glistened with the previous night's rain and gas lamps had only just been extinguished by the dawn's early light, Dr. Samuel Hartwell, a physician of considerable reputation, who maintained professional relationships with several of the city's funeral establishments, arrived at Morrison Funeral Home on Locust Street to perform what he believed would be a routine consultation regarding the preparation of a deceased patient under his care. But what he discovered upon entering the basement preparation room would challenge every assumption he held about the natural order of death, the capabilities of children, and the boundaries between the possible and the utterly inexplicable. The scene that greeted Dr. B. Hartwell in that gaslit chamber, with its characteristic odors of formaldehyde and camphor mixing with the musty dampness common to below-ground rooms in that era, was one that would be documented in meticulous detail in his journals, later submitted to the Philadelphia Medical Society and archived in records that persist to this day, records that describe with clinical precision an arrangement so disturbing, so fundamentally wrong, that 3 of the funeral home's employees had refused to enter the room until the doctor's arrival. 4 bodies, each in varying states of preparation for burial, had been moved from their original positions on the marble examination tables and arranged with deliberate precision in what could only be described as a tableau. Positioned in chairs that had been brought from the family's upstairs living quarters, their hands placed in specific gestures, their heads angled toward one another as if engaged in eternal conversation. And at the center of this impossible scene sat Eleanor Morrison, 7 years old, daughter of the funeral home's proprietor, Thomas Morrison, her dark hair neatly braided, her white pinafore dress somehow spotless despite the nature of her activities, calmly arranging the rigid fingers of a deceased merchant who had weighed, according to funeral records, approximately 240 pounds in life. Dr. Hartwell's initial report, written that very afternoon while details remained sharp in his memory, noted not just the physical impossibility of a child of Eleanor's size and strength accomplishing such feats of body manipulation, but more disturbingly, the absolute lack of fear or recognition of transgression in the child's demeanor when discovered. Her greeting to the doctor described as cheerful and welcoming, as though she had been discovered playing with dolls rather than arranging human corpses in elaborate death scenes. What makes this case particularly significant, what elevates it beyond mere morbid curiosity into the realm of documented medical mystery, is the extensive record-keeping that followed, the involvement of multiple credible witnesses from Philadelphia's medical and academic establishments, and the progressive escalation of events over the subsequent months that would transform this single disturbing discovery into one of the most thoroughly investigated and ultimately inexplicable cases in 19th-century medical literature. A case that raises questions even modern psychology and neuroscience struggle to adequately address. But before we dive into this nightmare, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if you're new here and love spine-chilling stories, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to be notified when the next one drops. Now, let's begin. Thomas Morrison had established his funeral business in 1878 at the age of 26 in a 3-story brick building on Locust Street that had previously housed a physician's practice, a fact that made the conversion to mortuary purposes relatively straightforward given the existing examination rooms and the building's discreet side entrance that allowed for the arrival and departure of deceased clients without disturbing the neighborhood's sensibilities. And over the course of 18 years, Morrison had built a reputation among Philadelphia's middle and upper middle classes as a funeral director of impeccable taste, professional discretion, and technical competence in an era when the handling of the dead was transitioning from family responsibility to professional service. The Morrison family structure, at the time of Dr. Hartwell's discovery in March 1896, consisted solely of Thomas and his daughter Eleanor, the child having been born on September 12, 1888, to Thomas and his wife Catherine Morrison, née Catherine Elizabeth Winters, daughter of a respected textile merchant whose family had maintained relationships with Philadelphia's established Protestant community for 3 generations. Catherine Morrison had survived Eleanor's difficult birth, a 30-hour labor that required the intervention of 2 physicians and left her weakened considerably. But she had lived through the initial crisis only to succumb 7 months later to what medical records describe as puerperal fever and complications from internal hemorrhaging that had never properly resolved, dying in the same building where her husband prepared strangers for burial. Her own funeral conducted with devastating irony in the establishment's main parlor in April of 1889. From the age of 7 months, therefore, Eleanor Morrison had been raised by her widower father in the unique and unsettling environment of a functioning funeral home, her childhood playrooms located directly above the preparation chambers where her father practiced his trade, her nursery, and later her bedroom, separated from the business of death by merely the thickness of Victorian floorboards and whatever psychological boundaries a growing child could construct in such circumstances. The building's layout placed the family's living quarters on the 2nd and 3rd floors, with the 2nd floor containing the main parlor where viewings and services were conducted, Thomas Morrison's private office, and a formal sitting room that served as the family's primary living space, while the 3rd floor housed the bedrooms and a small kitchen where a housekeeper, Mrs. Adelaide Chen, a widow of Chinese-Portuguese descent who had worked for the Morrison family since 1882, prepared meals and maintained the domestic spaces separate from the commercial areas below. The ground floor contained the public entrance, a reception area, a secondary viewing room for smaller services, and access to the basement level where the actual preparation of bodies occurred. That subterranean space equipped with marble tables, chemical storage, and all the instruments and materials required for embalming, cosmetic restoration, and the various procedures that transformed the newly deceased into the peacefully reposed figures presented to grieving families. Eleanor's upbringing in this environment had been noted by several family acquaintances and business associates as unusual but not necessarily harmful, with Thomas Morrison making efforts to maintain normal childhood experiences for his daughter, enrolling her in a private dame school run by the Mrs. Ashford on Walnut Street, ensuring her attendance at Sunday services at the Third Presbyterian Church, and attempting to provide the feminine guidance he felt inadequate to supply through the presence of Mrs. Chen and occasional visits from Catherine's sister, Margaret Winters Harrison, who lived across the river in Camden, New Jersey. The early signs of Eleanor's particular fascination with her father's work had been dismissed as the natural curiosity of an intelligent child. Her questions about death and the body's processes considered precocious rather than pathological. Her occasional presence in areas of the funeral home normally restricted to adults attributed to the simple fact that this was, after all, her home as well as her father's place of business, and the boundary between the two could never be as firmly maintained as it might be in households where death was an occasional visitor rather than a constant presence. Dr. Samuel Hartwell's professional relationship with the Morrison Funeral Home had been established in 1892, 4 years before the disturbing discovery of March 14th, when Thomas Morrison had sought the doctor's consultation regarding the proper medical certification of deaths and the professional courtesies between physicians and funeral directors that helped ensure smooth transitions of care from the dying to the deceased. And over those 4 years, Hartwell had referred numerous families to Morrison's establishment and had come to respect the funeral director's professionalism and technical competence, making the revelations about Eleanor's activities all the more disturbing, because they emerged not from a single shocking discovery, but from a gradual accumulation of incidents that Hartwell had documented in his private medical journals. Incidents that in isolation could be explained away, but in aggregate formed a pattern of behavior that defied conventional understanding. The first documented instance of Eleanor's presence in the preparation rooms, recorded in Hartwell's journal entry dated November 7, 1894, described his arrival at the funeral home to consult on a case of suspected poisoning, where he had discovered the then 6-year-old child sitting on a stool near one of the marble preparation tables, watching her father work with what Hartwell described as unusual intensity and comprehension for a child of her years. Her questions about the embalming process displaying knowledge of human anatomy that seemed far beyond her age and education. Thomas Morrison's response to Hartwell's gently expressed concern had been dismissive in that first instance, explaining that Eleanor had always been a curious child, that growing up in a funeral home naturally exposed her to aspects of death that other children remained sheltered from, and that he saw no harm in answering her questions honestly rather than fostering unhealthy fear or superstition about natural processes, an explanation that Hartwell had accepted at the time as reasonable, even progressive, given the Victorian tendency toward death denial and the potentially beneficial effects of demystifying mortality for children. The progressive nature of Eleanor's activities became apparent only through Hartwell's systematic record-keeping, his habit of noting observations from each visit to the Morrison establishment, revealing a pattern that Thomas Morrison himself, seeing his daughter daily, may have been too close to recognize, or perhaps too frightened to acknowledge, with subsequent journal entries documenting Eleanor's presence in the preparation rooms with increasing frequency, her questions evolving from simple curiosity to technical inquiries about chemical concentrations, tissue preservation, and post-mortem changes that suggested not merely observational learning, but active study of mortuary science. By the spring of 1895, when Eleanor was 6.5 years old, Hartwell's notes recorded instances of the child being found alone with bodies, her father having stepped away briefly for supplies or consultations, and while Thomas Morrison continued to dismiss these incidents as harmless, explaining that Eleanor knew not to touch anything and was merely keeping him company during long working hours when Mrs. Chen was occupied with household duties and the child had completed her schoolwork, Hartwell had begun to share his observations with colleagues in the Philadelphia medical community, including Dr. Marcus Ellsworth, a specialist in childhood development, and Dr. Agnes Pemberton, one of the few female physicians practicing in Philadelphia, whose particular interest in mental aberrations and nervous disorders would later prove crucial to the formal investigation. The medical community's growing awareness of Eleanor Morrison as a case worthy of professional attention began in earnest in December 1895, when Hartwell presented his accumulated observations at a private dinner attended by several members of the Philadelphia Medical Society, describing not only Eleanor's unprecedented access to her father's work, but also specific incidents that troubled him, including an occasion in October 1895 when he had discovered the child arranging the hands of a deceased woman into a position of prayer, and another in November when Eleanor had commented on the cause of a man's death with accuracy that she could not possibly have known through normal means, having identified internal hemorrhaging before any examination had been conducted. The establishment of a clear timeline through Hartwell's meticulous documentation revealed that Eleanor's behaviors had begun around age 5 with simple observation and questioning, had progressed to physical proximity and occasional touching of the deceased by age 6, and by age 7 had escalated to the active manipulation and arrangement of bodies that would culminate in the shocking tableau discovered in March 1896. A progression that suggested either a gradual loss of normal childhood boundaries regarding death or the systematic development of abilities and compulsions that existed outside any recognized framework of child psychology as it was understood in the Victorian era. The documented behaviors that Dr. Hartwell compiled throughout late 1895 and early 1896 painted a portrait of interactions between Eleanor Morrison and the deceased that progressed from merely unusual to genuinely impossible, with the child's activities ranging from simple rearrangement of limbs and facial features to elaborate tableaus that suggested not only physical capability far beyond her years, but also a conceptual relationship with death that existed entirely outside normal childhood psychology. And perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these documented incidents was not their increasing elaboration, but rather Eleanor's consistently matter-of-fact attitude toward the corpses, treating them with neither fear nor reverence, but rather as objects to be positioned and arranged according to some internal logic that she never fully explained to the adults who discovered her compositions. The specific tableau's arrangements discovered and documented included an incident on December the 3rd, 1895, when the night assistant, a man named Herbert Walsh, had entered the preparation room at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning to check on chemical bath temperatures and discovered 3 bodies, 2 elderly women and 1 middle-aged man, arranged in sitting positions around the central marble table as though engaged in conversation, their heads turned toward one another and their hands positioned in gestures that suggested animated discussion, an arrangement that Walsh reported had required him to wake Thomas Morrison immediately, despite the hour, because the sheer physical impossibility of a 7-year-old child moving and positioning adult corpses in this manner seemed to suggest either an intruder in the building or some occurrence that defied rational explanation. The incident that would become known in Hartwell's documentation as the Tea Party discovery occurred on January the 18th, 1896, when Mrs. Adelaide Chen, arriving early to begin her morning duties, had descended to the preparation level to retrieve cleaning supplies and discovered Eleanor seated on a small stool she had apparently brought from upstairs, positioned before 2 female bodies that had been dressed in their burial clothes the previous evening and were awaiting final cosmetic work before viewing services scheduled for that afternoon, the bodies arranged upright in chairs normally used by Morrison during his work. A child's tea set from Eleanor's playroom distributed between them with miniature cups positioned near their hands, and Eleanor herself pouring imaginary tea and conducting a conversation that Mrs. Chen described in her statement to Dr. Hartwell as speaking to them as naturally as if they were living guests in our parlour, asking them questions and then pausing as though listening to responses, and the most chilling aspect being not the strangeness of the scene, but the absolute normalcy of the child's demeanor, as though this were no different from playing with dolls. Eleanor's matter-of-fact attitude toward the corpses remained consistent across all documented encounters, with witnesses including her father, Mrs. Chen, Herbert Walsh, and Dr. Hartwell himself, noting that the child displayed none of the fear, disgust, or even the morbid fascination that might be expected from a child in such circumstances, but rather treated the deceased with a casual familiarity that suggested either a complete absence of normal psychological boundaries between living and dead, or perhaps a perception of the bodies as not truly dead at all, but rather in some intermediate state that made her interactions with them seem, to her at least, perfectly reasonable. The technical impossibility of Eleanor's physical accomplishments became increasingly difficult to dismiss or explain through conventional means, particularly after an incident on February 2nd, 1896, when Thomas Morrison, having left his daughter alone for no more than 15 minutes while he consulted with a client family in the upstairs parlour, returned to find that the body of a man named Lawrence Pemberton, deceased at age 47 from heart failure and weighing, according to Morrison's records, exactly 214 pounds, had been moved from the preparation table where Morrison had left it to a position near the room's western wall, repositioned on its side with arms arranged as though sleeping peacefully, a feat that would have required significant strength and knowledge of body mechanics that a 7-year-old child weighing perhaps 50 pounds herself could not possibly possess. The witnesses to Eleanor's activities, though limited to those who worked in or visited the Morrison establishment, provided testimonies that Hartwell collected and preserved, including Herbert Walsh's statement describing his growing unease during night shifts, when he could sometimes hear sounds from the preparation rooms that suggested movement when he knew Eleanor should have been asleep in her 3rd-floor bedroom, and Mrs. Chen's reluctant admission that she had on several occasions discovered the child in the basement preparation area at hours when she should have been at school or occupied with lessons, and perhaps most significantly, the testimony of James Northwood, a supply merchant who delivered embalming chemicals and had arrived early one morning in January to find Eleanor positioning the hands of an elderly woman with a precision and gentleness that suggested not childish play, but rather genuine care and purpose that disturbed him so profoundly that he had afterwards refused to make deliveries unless Thomas Morrison personally received them at the building's exterior entrance. Thomas Morrison's internal conflict during the winter and early spring of 1896 was documented in painful detail through diary entries that would later be provided to Dr. Hartwell and subsequently preserved in the medical archives at the University of Pennsylvania, entries that revealed a man torn between his duties as a father and his responsibilities as a business owner, between his desperate need to believe his daughter was merely an unusual child and his growing recognition that something genuinely impossible was occurring beneath his own roof, and the progression of these entries from January through March tracked the psychological deterioration of a man who had built his reputation on professionalism and discretion, watching that reputation crumble as whispers about his daughter spread through Philadelphia's tight-knit community of undertakers, physicians, and the families they served. His entry dated January 21st, 1896, just 3 days after Mrs. Chen's discovery of Eleanor's Tea Party tableau, captured Morrison's attempt at rational explanation, writing that Eleanor has always been a sensitive child, and her dear mother's absence has perhaps created in her a need for companionship that she fulfills through imaginative play, and while the setting of such play may seem macabre to others, I must remember that what is my workplace is her home, and she has never known an environment free from the presence of death. So perhaps what seems disturbing to others is merely her attempt to normalize and comprehend the work that occupies her father's time and attention. The business reputation that Thomas Morrison had spent 18 years carefully building began to erode measurably in February 1896, when families who had previously used the Morrison establishment for multiple generations began selecting other funeral homes for their needs, often with polite excuses about location convenience or cost considerations, but occasionally with more direct explanations that referenced concerns about the appropriateness of a child's presence in the preparation areas, or, more vaguely, discomfort with recent rumors about irregular occurrences at the Morrison building, and Morrison's meticulous business ledgers showed a decline in new client intake of approximately 40% between January and March, compared to the same period in previous years, a devastating reduction that threatened not only his livelihood, but also the building itself, as mortgage obligations and operating expenses remained constant, even as revenue declined. Morrison's attempts to protect his daughter's welfare while maintaining his professional standing led to increasingly elaborate explanations and justifications recorded in both his diary and in letters to concerned colleagues, including a particularly revealing letter dated February 14th, 1896, to fellow funeral director Martin Ashworth, in which Morrison wrote that the modern tendency toward sensationalism and superstition regarding matters of death has created an atmosphere where even innocent childhood curiosity becomes transformed into something sinister through the distorted lens of ignorance and fear, and I must stand firm in protecting my daughter from those who would make her peculiarities into something monstrous simply because they cannot understand a child raised without the usual barriers between life and death. The growing isolation that Thomas Morrison experienced as the incidents increased was documented not only in his own writings, but also in the observations of Dr. Hartwell, who noted in a journal entry from March 1st that Morrison had developed a haunted quality, with signs of significant sleep deprivation and a defensive posture when discussing his daughter, that suggests a man who has begun to doubt his own explanations, but cannot yet bring himself to acknowledge what those doubts might mean. And this isolation was compounded by Morrison's withdrawal from the professional and social circles he had previously frequented, declining invitations to the monthly Undertakers Association meetings, and avoiding the informal gatherings at medical society events where funeral directors often networked with the physicians who referred families to their establishments. Morrison's correspondence with medical authorities beginning in late February revealed his desperate search for explanations that would allow him to maintain his belief in his daughter's fundamental normalcy, with letters to Dr. Marcus Ellsworth inquiring about childhood conditions that might explain unusual strength or behavioral peculiarities, and a particularly poignant letter to Dr. Agnes Pemberton dated March the 7th, exactly 1 week before the discovery that would bring the situation to its crisis point, asking whether a child experiencing profound grief at the loss of a mother might develop elaborate coping mechanisms that manifest as unusual attachments to the deceased, and whether such attachments, while disturbing to observe, might actually serve a protective psychological function that should not be disrupted through outside intervention. A letter that Dr. Pemberton would later describe as the plea of a father who knew he was losing control of an impossible situation, but could not yet surrender the hope that love and understanding might somehow prove sufficient to resolve what logic and reason could not explain. Dr. Samuel Hartwell's decision to initiate a formal medical observation period on February 8, 1896, marked the transformation of Eleanor Morrison's case from a series of disturbing anecdotes into a systematic scientific investigation that would eventually engage some of the most prominent medical minds in Philadelphia and establish documentation practices that would influence psychiatric research methodology for decades to come. And Hartwell's background made him uniquely positioned to undertake this investigation, having completed his medical training at the University of Pennsylvania in 1883, before pursuing additional studies in the emerging field of psychiatry at McLean Hospital in Massachusetts, under the mentorship of Dr. Edward Cowles, one of the pioneers in applying scientific observation methods to mental phenomena, returning to Philadelphia in 1889 with a particular interest in childhood behavioral disorders and the psychological effects of unusual environmental factors on developing minds. His systematic documentation methodology, influenced by the case study approaches being developed in European psychiatric institutions, involved the creation of detailed observation logs that recorded not only Eleanor's actions but also the precise circumstances surrounding each incident, including time of day, environmental conditions, the identity and condition of any deceased individuals present, the child's physical appearance and demeanor, her exact words when she spoke, and the responses of any witnesses present, with Hartwell maintaining separate journals for objective observations and his own interpretative analysis, recognizing even then the importance of distinguishing between documented facts and theoretical speculation. The introduction of Dr. Agnes Pemberton to the investigation in late February represented a significant expansion of medical attention to the case, as Pemberton, one of only a handful of female physicians practicing in Philadelphia, and a specialist in pediatric medicine who had published several papers on childhood nervous disorders in the American Journal of Medical Sciences, brought both a different perspective and additional credibility to observations that might otherwise have been dismissed as the overactive imagination of a single practitioner. And her involvement began at Hartwell's specific request after Thomas Morrison's letter to her on March the 7th revealed the depth of the father's distress and his desperate need for medical authorities who might provide explanations that would allow him to protect his daughter from both public scrutiny and more invasive interventions. The Victorian-era understanding of childhood psychology in 1896 remained primitive by modern standards, with prevailing theories still heavily influenced by moral interpretations of behavior rather than scientific analysis of psychological development, and concepts such as childhood trauma, dissociative states, and the complex ways that environment shapes psychological formation were only beginning to emerge through the work of pioneers like Hartwell and Pemberton, creating a context in which Eleanor's behaviors existed in a theoretical vacuum, where medical science, popular superstition, and religious interpretation competed to provide explanatory frameworks, none of them entirely adequate to the documented facts of what this 7-year-old child was apparently accomplishing. The case's growing significance in medical circles became evident through the correspondence that Hartwell preserved, including letters from Dr. William Osler at Johns Hopkins Hospital requesting copies of observation notes, inquiries from Dr. Boris Sidis in New York, who was developing new theories about the subconscious mind and abnormal psychology, and particularly notable interest from Dr. Pierre Janet in Paris, whose work on psychological automatism and dissociation was beginning to revolutionize European psychiatry, with Janet's letter dated March 19, 1896, expressing his view that the Morrison case represented either a remarkable example of hysterical strength in a child subject, suggesting capacities of the dissociated personality far beyond what current theory would predict, or alternatively, if the reports are accurate in every detail, a phenomenon that challenges our fundamental understanding of the relationship between consciousness, physical capability, and the boundaries that we assume exist between the living and the dead. A statement that captured the essential dilemma facing every medical professional who examined the evidence that Hartwell was systematically compiling in his increasingly voluminous case files. The physical impossibilities that Eleanor Morrison accomplished between January and March of 1896 were documented with scientific precision by Dr. Hartwell and his colleagues, creating a file of evidence that defied every rational explanation that Victorian medical science could propose. And the most disturbing aspect of these documented incidents was not simply that a 7-year-old child weighing approximately 48 pounds, according to Dr. Pemberton's examination, was moving adult bodies, but rather the specific nature of what she accomplished and the utter absence of any mechanism by which such feats could be explained through conventional understanding of human physical capability or mechanical advantage. The incident of February 23, 1896, documented by both Dr. Hartwell and the funeral home assistant Robert Chen, involved the body of Gerard Whitmore, a stevedore who had died from injuries sustained in a dock accident, whose body measured 6 feet 2 inches in height, and whose weight was recorded at 214 pounds in the Morrison establishment's intake documentation. And this body was discovered to have been moved from the preparation table in the basement embalming room to the second-floor viewing parlor, a distance that required navigation up a steep staircase of 17 steps, with the body then positioned in a seated arrangement in one of the viewing chairs, with its hands folded precisely in its lap, and its head tilted at an angle that Dr. Hartwell noted suggested an understanding of how to compensate for post-mortem rigidity that even experienced morticians found challenging to manage. Dr. Hartwell's measurements and calculations, preserved in his observation logs and later reviewed by engineering consultants from the University of Pennsylvania, determined that moving Whitmore's body up the staircase would have required the ability to lift and manipulate at minimum 150 pounds at various points during the ascent, accounting for the mechanics of leverage and the distribution of weight across the body's length. And this calculation assumed optimal positioning and technique that would be remarkable even for an adult male with professional training in body handling, making the accomplishment by a 7-year-old child physically impossible, according to every understood principle of biomechanics and human muscular capacity. The precise positioning that Eleanor achieved in her tableau arrangements demonstrated anatomical knowledge that Dr. Agnes Pemberton found particularly inexplicable, noting in her report dated March 11th that the child's placement of bodies showed an understanding of joint articulation, the effects of rigor mortis on different muscle groups at various stages of decomposition, and the specific techniques required to achieve natural-appearing poses in deceased subjects, writing that the positioning I observed in the February 28th incident involving the Carmichael family arrangement required knowledge of post-mortem changes that is typically acquired only through years of professional mortuary training and practical experience, yet Miss Morrison has had no formal instruction, and her father reports never discussing technical aspects of his profession in her presence, leaving unexplained how she possesses not merely the physical capability to move these bodies, but also the sophisticated understanding of how to position them in ways that account for the specific challenges that deceased tissues present. The absence of any signs of mechanical assistance or accomplice involvement was verified through multiple investigators' examinations of the funeral home premises, with Dr. Hartwell personally inspecting the building on March 3rd, specifically looking for evidence of pulley systems, wheeled platforms, or any device that might explain how bodies were being transported, finding nothing beyond the standard professional equipment that Thomas Morrison employed in his normal operations, and the timing of incidents, which occurred during periods when Morrison himself could account for his location elsewhere in the building or away on professional calls, eliminated the possibility that the father was accomplishing these relocations and attributing them to his daughter, while the testimony of staff members who had observed Eleanor in the presence of bodies, including Robert Chen's sworn statement that he had briefly glimpsed the child apparently dragging the body of an adult woman across the preparation room floor with no visible effort or strain, created a growing file of inexplicable evidence that challenged the fundamental assumption that what was being reported must somehow involve either misperception or deliberate fraud. The transcripts from Dr. Samuel Hartwell's interviews with Eleanor Morrison, conducted between February 15th and March 28, 1896, and preserved in the archives of the Philadelphia Medical Society, represent perhaps the most disturbing element of the entire case documentation, not because they reveal a child aware of wrongdoing or displaying signs of mental disturbance that Victorian psychiatry might recognize, but rather because they demonstrate a matter-of-fact casualness about interactions with the deceased that suggested either a complete dissociation from normal childhood psychology or alternatively an authentic perception of death that existed entirely outside conventional understanding of what should be possible for a 7-year-old mind to comprehend or articulate. In the initial interview dated February 15th, when Dr. Hartwell asked Eleanor to describe what she did when she visited the preparation rooms, the child responded according to his transcription with the words, "I help them get comfortable because they come here confused, and father is always so busy with the other things that somebody needs to make sure they understand where they are now and that everything will be all right." A statement that Hartwell noted she delivered with the same tone and inflection that another child might use when describing helping her mother set the table for dinner, displaying no awareness that her activities might be considered unusual or disturbing. Eleanor's claims of communication with the deceased, detailed across multiple interview sessions, involved descriptions of the dead speaking to her not through voices that others might hear, but rather through what she called the quiet talking that happens underneath, explaining to Dr. Pemberton on March the 2nd that they don't use mouths anymore because mouths are for the alive people, but they can still tell me things if I listen the right way, and mostly they want to tell me about who they were and what happened to make them come here to father's house. And when pressed by Pemberton to clarify whether she meant she was imagining what the deceased might say, Eleanor became adamant, stating according to the transcript that, "I don't make it up. I don't have to make it up, because they tell me themselves, and sometimes they tell me about the people who are coming next, before father even knows they're coming." The specific predictions about incoming bodies that Eleanor made during the observation period proved accurate in ways that Dr. Hartwell found impossible to explain through coincidence or lucky guessing, including her statement on March 8th that a lady with red hair who fell down the stairs will come tomorrow and she's very upset because she didn't mean to leave her babies, which preceded by 18 hours the arrival of Margaret Brennan, a 28-year-old mother of 3, who had died from a fall down her tenement building's staircase, and whose hair color and family situation Eleanor could not have known through any conventional means, with Thomas Morrison's records confirming that he received the call to collect Mrs. Brennan's body only on the morning of March the 9th, with no prior knowledge of the case. Eleanor's detailed knowledge of causes of death before bodies underwent examination was documented in multiple instances, most notably on March 19th, when she told Dr. Hartwell that a recently arrived elderly man has the bad sickness in his stomach that ate him from the inside, and he knew it was there for a long time, but he was too frightened to tell the doctors, which Dr. Hartwell verified the following day when Thomas Morrison's examination revealed clear evidence of advanced gastric carcinoma that subsequent inquiry with the deceased's family confirmed the man had suspected but never sought medical confirmation for, having confided his fears only to his wife in private conversations. The chilling casualness of Eleanor's explanations, her complete lack of fear or distress when discussing the dead, and her apparent inability to understand why adults found her activities concerning created a psychological profile that Dr. Hartwell characterized in his notes as either the most complete dissociative state I have encountered in clinical practice, allowing this child to interact with deceased bodies as though they were living playmates without any recognition of the profound boundary she is transgressing, or alternatively, and far more disturbing to contemplate, a genuine perceptual reality in which the barrier between life and death is somehow permeable in ways that our medical and spiritual understanding has never adequately recognized or documented. The escalation that occurred throughout March 1896 transformed what had been a disturbing series of isolated incidents into a pattern of behavior so elaborate and inexplicable that it pushed both the Morrison household and the investigating medical authorities toward a crisis point that would ultimately make the case's containment impossible, and the progression documented in Dr. Hartwell's daily observation logs reveals a child whose interactions with the deceased were becoming not merely more frequent, but exponentially more complex, in ways that suggested either a rapidly deteriorating mental state, or alternatively, a deepening of whatever inexplicable connection Eleanor Morrison possessed with the bodies that passed through her father's establishment. On March 12th, Robert Chen arrived for his morning duties to discover what he described in his testimony as an arrangement that looked like a family gathering for Sunday dinner, involving 5 bodies that had been positioned around the viewing parlor's central table with such precision that each corpse appeared to be engaged in conversation with the others, their heads turned at appropriate angles and their hands positioned as though in the midst of animated discussion. And what made this tableau particularly disturbing, according to Chen's account, was that the bodies represented individuals from completely different backgrounds and time periods, having arrived at the funeral home across a span of 2 weeks, meaning Eleanor had somehow relocated bodies from the cold storage area and arranged them in this complex configuration during the night hours when her father believed her to be sleeping in the family's upstairs quarters. The discovery on March the 16th proved even more alarming when Thomas Morrison himself, entering the main chapel at dawn, found Eleanor standing at the lectern dressed in one of his professional mourning coats that dragged on the floor behind her, conducting what appeared to be a complete funeral service for 3 bodies she had arranged in viewing positions before the altar, and Morrison's diary entry from that date, written in handwriting that Dr. Hartwell noted showed visible tremor compared to earlier entries, described his daughter's recitation as word perfect in its adherence to the Presbyterian funeral rites, including specific prayers and scriptural passages that I know with absolute certainty I have never spoken in her presence, and most disturbing of all, she inserted the correct names of the deceased into the service at appropriate moments, despite the fact that 2 of these individuals had arrived only the previous evening, and she could not possibly have accessed the documentation that would have told her their identities. Eleanor's accurate recitations of strangers' life details during these mock services created documentation that multiple witnesses found impossible to explain through any conventional means, with the incident of March 21st, recorded by both Dr. Hartwell and Dr. Pemberton, who had remained at the Morrison establishment overnight, specifically to observe Eleanor's nocturnal activities, involving the child standing beside the body of Arthur Whitman, a 43-year-old clerk who had died of heart failure, and speaking for nearly 20 minutes about Whitman's childhood in Baltimore, his complicated relationship with his younger brother, his secret shame about financial difficulties that he had hidden from his wife, and his final thoughts in the moments before his death, all details that subsequent investigation by Dr. Hartwell confirmed as accurate through interviews with Whitman's widow and surviving family members, who expressed shock that such private information, much of it known only to the deceased himself, could have been accessed by a child who had no connection to their family. The testimony of James Macready, the night watchman whom Thomas Morrison had employed beginning March 10th, in a desperate attempt to maintain some supervision over the funeral home's nighttime hours, provided perhaps the most disturbing account of Eleanor's activities during this escalation period, with Macready's written statement dated March 24th, describing how he had observed the child through a partially open door, moving between the bodies in the preparation room like she was tending to living patients in a hospital ward, adjusting their positions, speaking to each in turn in a voice too quiet for me to distinguish words, and at one point appearing to listen intently to the body of an elderly woman as though receiving instructions or information, nodding her head in response to something that I, in my position across the room, could neither hear nor perceive. Macready's resignation, submitted on March 25th after only 15 days of employment, stated simply that no amount of wages can compensate for the profound unnaturalness of what I have witnessed in the Morrison establishment, and I fear for my own spiritual well-being should I continue to expose myself to phenomena that I lack the capacity to understand or accept. And his departure represented only the most dramatic in a series of staff resignations that left Thomas Morrison increasingly isolated and desperate, with the funeral home's assistant embalmer, both cleaning staff members, and even the business's bookkeeper, all terminating their employment between March 15th and March 28th, each citing in their various ways the impossible and terrifying nature of what they had observed or heard described regarding Eleanor's interactions with the dead. The formation of a formal investigative committee by the Philadelphia Medical Society on March 28, 1896, represented the medical establishment's recognition that the Morrison case had transcended the boundaries of individual clinical curiosity and had become a phenomenon requiring the coordinated expertise of multiple specialties and the institutional credibility that only an official inquiry could provide. And the committee's composition reflected both the emerging sophistication of late Victorian medical science and the profound uncertainty about how to categorize what was occurring at the Morrison funeral home, with its membership including Dr. Samuel Hartwell as primary investigator, Dr. Agnes Pemberton, whose specialty in disorders of childhood provided crucial psychological expertise, Dr. Robert Thornton, who brought 2 decades of neurological experience from Pennsylvania Hospital, Dr. James Whitmore, whose background in emerging theories of hysteria and suggestion offered one potential explanatory framework, and Dr. Elizabeth Garrett, whose training in both traditional medicine and what was then called medical psychology provided a bridge between physiological and mental health assessments. The committee's initial meeting on March 30th, documented in minutes that were preserved in the Philadelphia Medical Society archives and later published in edited form in the Journal of Mental Science in 1897, reveals the competing theoretical frameworks that the medical establishment brought to Eleanor's case, with Dr. Whitmore arguing forcefully for an interpretation based on collective hysteria and suggestion, proposing that Eleanor had somehow absorbed information about the deceased through overheard conversations and environmental cues that her father and his staff had failed to recognize consciously, while Dr. Thornton advocated for a neurological examination that might reveal unusual brain development or seizure disorders that could explain her behaviors and apparent perceptions. Dr. Pemberton's specialized examination of Eleanor, conducted over 4 sessions between April 2nd and April 9th in a specially prepared room at Pennsylvania Hospital, designed to eliminate the environmental factors of the funeral home itself, produced findings that complicated rather than clarified the case, with her formal report dated April 12th, noting that Eleanor demonstrates none of the expected signs of hysteria, showing no evidence of emotional volatility, physical conversion symptoms, or the attention-seeking behaviors typically associated with hysterical presentations in children, and indeed presents as remarkably calm and well-adjusted by all conventional measures of childhood psychological development, displaying appropriate attachment to her father, age-appropriate cognitive functioning, normal sleep and appetite patterns, and social engagement skills that, while somewhat limited by her unusual upbringing, nevertheless fall within the range of ordinary childhood capacity. The physical examinations conducted by Dr. Thornton found Eleanor to be in excellent health, with no neurological abnormalities detectable through standard assessment procedures, no signs of seizure activity or other disturbances of brain function, normal reflexes and sensory responses, and physical development entirely consistent with a well-nourished child of 7 years. Conclusions that eliminated several of the more straightforward medical explanations that the committee had hoped might account for her behaviors. The published preliminary findings that appeared in the April 18, 1896 edition of the Philadelphia Medical Journal, written with deliberate caution and clinical restraint, acknowledged that the case of Eleanor Morrison presents the medical community with a constellation of behaviors and apparent capacities that resist categorization within our current understanding of childhood psychology, physical capability, or the boundaries between normal perception and claimed paranormal sensitivity. And while we cannot endorse extraordinary explanations without extraordinary evidence, we must equally acknowledge that conventional frameworks have thus far proven inadequate to explain the documented phenomena associated with this case. The containment that the medical establishment had maintained through careful clinical documentation and measured public statements collapsed entirely on April 22, 1896, when the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin published an exposé under the sensational headline, "The Child Who Speaks with the Dead, Unholy Phenomena at City Funeral Home," an article written by journalist Margaret Whitley, who had obtained details from a former Morrison employee and whose vivid descriptions of Eleanor's activities with corpses ignited a firestorm of public reaction that transformed the case from a matter of medical curiosity into a full-scale moral panic that gripped the city throughout the final weeks of April and into May. Within 48 hours of the Bulletin's initial article, every major newspaper in Philadelphia had published their own coverage, with the Philadelphia Inquirer running a front-page story on April 24th titled, "Medical Men Baffled by Morrison Girl's Impossible Powers," while the more sensationalist Philadelphia Press declared, "Demon Child or Divine Gift, the mystery that haunts Callowhill Street." And the competing accounts ranged from relatively restrained reporting that emphasized the medical investigation to lurid speculation about supernatural possession, divine judgment, and the corruption of childhood innocence through exposure to death. The public reaction documented in letters to newspaper editors, church sermons transcribed in parish records, and the observations recorded by police officers assigned to maintain order outside the Morrison establishment revealed a city profoundly disturbed by the implications of Eleanor's case, with some viewing her as a victim of demonic influence who required salvation through spiritual intervention, others seeing her abilities as evidence of spiritualist claims about communication with the deceased that the scientific establishment refused to acknowledge, and still others, particularly within Philadelphia's growing evangelical Protestant communities, interpreting the entire affair as divine judgment upon a society that had strayed too far from biblical truth. Religious authorities across denominational lines issued statements throughout late April, with Archbishop Patrick Ryan of the Philadelphia Archdiocese declaring on April 26th that while the Church does not pronounce upon matters still under investigation, we must remind the faithful that commerce with the dead outside the bounds of Christian prayer and remembrance represents a dangerous threshold that no child should cross and no parent should permit. While Reverend Thomas Davies of the First Presbyterian Church published a lengthy theological analysis in the Presbyterian Witness, arguing that the Morrison case demonstrated the wages of a society that has placed scientific materialism above spiritual discernment and allowed the natural boundaries between the living and the dead to be transgressed in the name of medical inquiry. The crowds that began gathering outside the Morrison funeral home from April 23rd onward required increasing police presence to prevent what Captain William Sterling of the Philadelphia Police described in his reports as a volatile situation in which curiosity, seekers, religious zealots, grieving family members seeking contact with their own deceased loved ones, and hostile citizens convinced of diabolical influence have created a daily assembly that threatens public order and the safety of the Morrison family. And the police logs from late April document incidents ranging from attempted forcible entry by individuals claiming religious authority to exorcise the child, to desperate parents seeking Eleanor's help in communicating with their own dead children, to threatening confrontations by citizens who demanded the child be removed from her father's custody and placed in institutional care. The sensationalist press demonstrated little of the medical community's restraint, with the Philadelphia press publishing increasingly elaborate accounts that went far beyond documented evidence, including an April 28th article claiming that Eleanor had predicted the exact time and manner of 3 deaths that subsequently occurred precisely as she had described, though no corroboration for these claims existed in any medical records or credible witness testimony. The contrast between the careful, measured language of the medical committee's published findings and the inflammatory rhetoric of the popular press created 2 parallel narratives of the Morrison case that competed for public acceptance, with Dr. Hartwell publishing a letter in the Philadelphia Inquirer on April 30th, pleading for rational consideration of a phenomenon that, however unusual and disturbing, deserves scientific investigation free from the distorting influences of sensationalism and superstition, while the same edition of the paper featured an editorial declaring the case evidence of spiritual realities that materialist science has long denied and can no longer ignore. The siege mentality that Thomas Morrison described in diary entries from late April reflected a family increasingly isolated and under threat, with his April 29th entry noting that, "We have become prisoners in our own home, unable to conduct business as the crowds make normal operations impossible, unable to venture outside without confrontation and harassment, and Eleanor herself has begun showing signs of the strain, withdrawing into silence and spending hours in her room rather than moving through the building as she once did freely. And I find myself wondering whether the investigation that I initially welcomed as potential salvation has instead brought upon us an exposure more damaging than any private affliction could have been." The formal request for religious intervention came on May 1st, 1896, not from Thomas Morrison himself, but from his sister Margaret Morrison Caldwell, who had travelled from Boston upon hearing of the family's crisis, and who, as a devout Catholic, insisted that the phenomena surrounding Eleanor required spiritual assessment and possible ecclesiastical action beyond what medical science could provide. And her appeal to Father Michael Brennan of St. John the Evangelist Church on Race Street initiated a religious engagement with the case that would prove as inconclusive and disturbing as the medical investigation that preceded it. Father Brennan, a 43-year-old priest who had served in Philadelphia for 18 years and who combined traditional Catholic orthodoxy with a cautiously progressive attitude toward scientific inquiry, arrived at the Morrison funeral home on the evening of May 1st, carrying the ritual implements for blessing and spiritual protection, and his personal journal, portions of which were later published in Catholic theological journals in 1898, described his first encounter with Eleanor as profoundly unsettling, not because the child displayed any obvious signs of demonic influence or spiritual corruption, but rather because she seemed entirely ordinary, a small girl with dark hair and pale complexion who greeted me politely and showed neither fear nor particular interest in my clerical status, responding to my questions with simple directness and displaying none of the aversion to sacred objects or religious imagery that traditional signs of possession would suggest. Father Brennan's religious observation over the subsequent 2 days, conducted with Thomas Morrison's reluctant permission, and under the watchful documentation of Dr. Hartwell, who insisted on maintaining medical records of any interventions, involved Eleanor's presence during prayers of blessing, her handling of religious articles including a crucifix and rosary beads blessed by Archbishop Ryan himself, and her participation in religious ceremonies designed to assess spiritual influence or vulnerability. The results, meticulously documented in both Father Brennan's ecclesiastical reports and Dr. Hartwell's parallel medical observations, demonstrated that Eleanor showed no adverse reaction to any religious practices or objects, holding the Blessed Crucifix without discomfort, responding appropriately to prayers, and displaying familiarity with Catholic liturgy that reflected her early childhood religious education before her behaviors had begun isolating the family from normal parish participation. The attempted blessing of Eleanor herself, performed by Father Brennan on the afternoon of May the 2nd, using the traditional prayers for protection against spiritual harm, proceeded without incident until the moment when the priest concluded the formal blessing, and Eleanor, according to Father Brennan's account, looked directly at him and stated with complete calm that the words don't reach where they need to go because the people I help aren't in the places your prayers go to. A statement that the priest found theologically troubling, as it suggested not demonic influence, but rather a cosmology fundamentally incompatible with Christian understanding of death and the afterlife. The documented failure of spiritual intervention to produce any change in Eleanor's behaviors or apparent abilities created significant theological debate within both Catholic and Protestant religious communities throughout May 1896, with traditionalist clergy arguing that the ineffectiveness of blessing indicated either insufficient faith on the part of those involved or demonic influence of such strength that more intensive ecclesiastical action, including formal exorcism, might be required, while more progressive religious thinkers, including Father Brennan himself in a controversial article published in the American Catholic Quarterly Review in July 1896, proposed that we must consider whether phenomena that appear supernatural may in fact represent aspects of God's creation that lie beyond current theological categorization, natural laws not yet understood rather than violations of divine order, and whether our religious frameworks, developed in ages with different understanding of the world's complexity, may require expansion rather than rigid application to cases that confound our expectations. The intersection of faith and emerging science that the Morrison case represented became a focal point for larger cultural debates in late Victorian America about the boundaries of religious authority in an age of increasing scientific specialization, with some religious leaders viewing the medical establishment's inability to explain Eleanor's case as vindication of spiritual realities that materialist science denied, while others worried that claiming supernatural causation for unexplained phenomena would undermine religious credibility in an era when scientific methodology was demonstrating explanatory power across numerous domains previously attributed to divine mystery. The convergence of medical observation, religious scrutiny, and public fascination reached its terrible culmination on the night of May 3rd, 1896, when Dr. Samuel Hartwell, responding to an urgent summons delivered by Thomas Morrison's remaining assistant at approximately 11:30 in the evening, arrived at the Morrison funeral home to discover a scene that would be described in his subsequent report to the Philadelphia Medical Society as beyond anything previously documented in this already extraordinary case, a tableau of such elaborate construction and disturbing implication that it challenges the boundaries of what could be accomplished by any individual, let alone a 7-year-old child, within the time frame established by witness testimony. The preparation room in the basement of the funeral home, where Eleanor had been discovered on numerous previous occasions arranging bodies, contained on this night exactly 12 corpses, 7 male and 5 female, ranging in age from a young man of approximately 25 years to an elderly woman estimated at 78, all of whom had been delivered to the Morrison establishment within the previous 4 days for preparation and burial, and all of whom had been removed from their individual preparation tables and arranged in a precise circular formation, positioned in seated postures with their backs to the center of the circle and their faces directed outward, their hands positioned on their laps in identical gestures of repose. The entire arrangement requiring physical manipulation that previous investigations had already established should have been impossible for a child of Eleanor's size and strength. At the exact center of this circular arrangement of deceased bodies, lying on the cold stone floor with her arms extended outward and her pale face directed toward the ceiling, was Eleanor Morrison herself, unconscious and unresponsive to initial attempts at rousing, her breathing shallow but regular, her pulse weak but steady, and her condition suggesting not sleep, but rather some form of profound dissociative state that Dr. Hartwell, drawing upon his psychiatric training, recognized as beyond simple unconsciousness. The discovery was made by night watchman Robert Chen, whose employment had continued despite his previous terrified testimony about Eleanor's activities, and whose account recorded by police investigators described hearing what he characterized as a sound like singing or chanting, words in no language I recognized, coming from the preparation room at approximately 11 o'clock. And upon investigating with considerable reluctance, finding the door to the preparation room standing open and the scene within exactly as Dr. Hartwell would subsequently observe it, prompting Chen to immediately summon Thomas Morrison from the family's upstairs quarters and dispatch a messenger for medical assistance. Dr. Hartwell's examination of Eleanor at the scene, conducted before moving her and documented in meticulous detail, noted that her clothing showed no signs of physical exertion, no perspiration or dishevelment that would be expected from the enormous physical labor of moving 12 adult bodies, no bruising or strain injuries to her small frame, and most disturbingly, her hands, when he examined them carefully under lamplight, bore faint marks that he described as resembling the impression left by grasping something with tremendous force, though what she could have gripped to leave such marks I cannot determine, as nothing in the immediate vicinity shows corresponding evidence of contact. The revival of Eleanor, approximately 20 minutes after Dr. Hartwell's arrival, involved standard medical stimulation techniques, including smelling salts and gentle physical stimulation, and her return to consciousness was gradual, her eyes opening slowly, and her first utterances, recorded by Dr. Hartwell in his notes taken at the scene, consisting of fragmented phrases including, "They wanted to see each other," "all the directions at once," and most cryptically, "The pattern isn't finished, but I can't hold any more," statements delivered in a voice that witnesses described as distant and hollow, lacking her usual childhood intonation. The immediate aftermath involved Eleanor's removal to the family's living quarters upstairs, where Dr. Hartwell conducted a thorough physical examination, finding no injuries or apparent medical crisis beyond profound exhaustion, while downstairs the bodies remained in their circular arrangement until the following morning, when they were photographed by police investigators at Dr. Hartwell's insistence before being returned to individual preparation, and those photographs, preserved in the Philadelphia Police Department archives, constitute some of the most striking visual documentation of the entire Morrison case. Thomas Morrison's breaking point, evident in the decisions made in the 48 hours following the May 3rd incident, manifested in his written notification to all families with deceased currently in his care that the Morrison Funeral Home would be ceasing operations immediately, his formal withdrawal of cooperation with the Medical Investigation Committee, and his rejection of Father Brennan's offer of continued spiritual assistance, with his brief statement to Dr. Hartwell on May the 5th, recorded as simply, "I will not sacrifice my daughter to either scientific curiosity or religious judgment, and what happens from this moment forward will be decided by family alone, without outside interference regardless of how well-intentioned." The disappearance of Thomas Morrison and his daughter Eleanor from Philadelphia occurred with remarkable swiftness in the week following the May 3rd incident, with property records indicating that Morrison finalized the sale of the funeral home building and business assets to the Henderson & Sons Funeral Company on May 8, 1896, accepting a price significantly below market value in exchange for immediate transaction completion, and witness accounts from neighbors on Callow Hill Street describing the departure of a hired carriage from the Morrison residence in the early morning hours of May the 10th, carrying what appeared to be a modest number of personal belongings and 2 passengers whose faces were obscured by the pre-dawn darkness and by deliberate arrangement of travel blankets and luggage. The conflicting reports regarding the Morrison family's destination that emerged in subsequent weeks reflected both genuine uncertainty and deliberate misinformation, with ticket agent testimony at Philadelphia's Broad Street station indicating that a man matching Thomas Morrison's description purchased railway tickets to Pittsburgh on May 10th, while separate accounts from the Philadelphia Port Authority documented a T. Morrison listed as passenger aboard a coastal vessel departing for Boston on May the 12th, and still other reports, never conclusively verified, suggested the family had traveled south toward Baltimore, or even as far as Richmond. The contradictory nature of these accounts indicating either multiple false trails deliberately established or simple misidentification in an era before systematic documentation made tracking individuals across state lines readily achievable. The Morrison Funeral Home building at 412 Callowhill Street, sold to Henderson & Sons primarily for the established business reputation and client relationships rather than for continued operation at that specific location, was stripped of its funeral preparation equipment within 2 weeks of the Morrison departure, with the building subsequently converted to residential apartments by 1897, and the preparation room in the basement where Eleanor had been discovered, surrounded by 12 arranged corpses, was, according to building modification records preserved in Philadelphia City Archives, sealed with brick and concrete, the new owners apparently preferring to reduce the building's usable space rather than maintain that particular chamber for any purpose. The Medical Investigation Committee, convened by the Philadelphia Medical Society, having lost access to its primary subject of study with Eleanor's departure, nevertheless proceeded to compile and publish its findings in a comprehensive report issued in September 1896 under the title Documentation of Anomalous Behaviors in a Minor Child, the Morrison Case, a 68-page document that carefully detailed the observed phenomena while scrupulously avoiding definitive conclusions about causation, with the report's summary stating that, while numerous hypotheses may be proposed ranging from elaborate deception to genuine manifestation of abilities inconsistent with current physiological understanding, the committee finds that available evidence, though extensively documented, proves insufficient for determining with certainty which explanation corresponds to objective reality. Dr. Samuel Hartwell's continued research into the Morrison case extended well beyond the family's disappearance, with his personal papers, donated to the College of Physicians of Philadelphia upon his death in 1924, revealing decades of correspondence with medical colleagues across the United States and Europe, inquiring about similar cases, extensive notes on emerging psychological theories that might provide explanatory frameworks, and a manuscript draft for a book tentatively titled The Morrison Phenomenon, Medical Observations of Inexplicable Childhood Behaviors, that was never completed or published, suggesting that Hartwell remained professionally and personally haunted by his inability to reach satisfactory conclusions about what he had witnessed. The attempts to locate the Morrison family in the years following their departure from Philadelphia involved both official inquiries and private investigation efforts, with Dr. Agnes Pemberton reportedly hiring a private detective agency in 1897 to trace the family's movements, an investigation that produced reports of possible Morrison sightings in Chicago in 1898 and in San Francisco in 1899, though neither lead resulted in confirmed contact. And Father Michael Brennan's correspondence preserved in the archives of the Archdiocese of Philadelphia includes letters written to parish priests in multiple cities requesting information about any family matching the Morrison description, all inquiries that apparently yielded no definitive results, leaving the ultimate fate and location of Thomas and Eleanor Morrison as one of the enduring mysteries surrounding this already mysterious case. The examination of the Morrison case through the lens of contemporary psychological and psychiatric understanding reveals multiple theoretical frameworks that might provide partial explanations for the documented phenomena, though none proves entirely satisfactory in addressing all aspects of what was observed and recorded by credible witnesses between 1894 and 1896. With modern dissociative disorder diagnoses offering perhaps the most academically palatable interpretation, suggesting that Eleanor Morrison may have experienced severe dissociative episodes triggered by early childhood trauma, specifically her mother's death when Eleanor was mere weeks old, resulting in altered states of consciousness, during which she could have performed actions later unremembered. Though this explanation struggles to account for the physical impossibilities documented by multiple medical observers regarding her manipulation of adult corpses, significantly exceeding her body weight, and the detailed knowledge she demonstrated about deceased individuals she had never encountered in life. Alternative theories proposed by researchers examining the historical documentation include the possibility of elaborate fabrication involving Thomas Morrison himself, potentially staging scenes and coaching his daughter to create the appearance of supernatural ability for reasons that remain obscure, whether financial gain through notoriety, psychological disturbance in the father manifesting as exploitation of his child, or some complex grief response to his wife's death, though the extensive medical observation conducted by Dr. Hartwell and Dr. Pemberton, both trained professionals with reputations that would be destroyed by participation in obvious fraud, makes wholesale fabrication difficult to accept, without impugning the integrity of the entire Philadelphia medical establishment of the 1890s. The examination of psychiatric literature from the past century reveals several cases bearing superficial similarities to the Morrison phenomenon, including the 1911 case of the Blackwood girl in Edinburgh, who reportedly demonstrated uncanny knowledge about deceased individuals at her father's medical practice. The 1923 documentation of twin boys in Prague, who were observed engaging in elaborate interactions with corpses at a hospital morgue. And the 1956 case file from a psychiatric institution in Massachusetts, describing an adolescent female patient who claimed ongoing communication with deceased individuals and who demonstrated anatomical knowledge inconsistent with her educational background. Though in each of these cases the documentation proves less extensive and the investigation less rigorous than that conducted by the Philadelphia Medical Society regarding Eleanor Morrison, leaving the 1896 case as perhaps the most thoroughly recorded instance of such phenomena in medical literature. The influence of the Morrison case on the developing field of child psychology in the early 20th century can be traced through citations in academic papers and textbooks published between 1900 and 1940, with the case frequently referenced in discussions of childhood trauma responses, dissociative behaviors in minors, and the intersection of grief and psychological development. Though notably these academic treatments generally focused on the aspects of the case most amenable to conventional psychological interpretation, while quietly setting aside the physical impossibilities and predictive knowledge that defied ready explanation, reflecting the broader tendency in emerging psychological sciences to emphasize observable and reproducible phenomena while categorizing outlier cases as insufficiently documented or contaminated by observer bias. The unresolved questions that persist more than a century after Eleanor Morrison's disappearance from Philadelphia include fundamental issues of what actually occurred in the basement of the Morrison funeral home during those months in early 1896, whether the child possessed genuine abilities that current scientific frameworks cannot accommodate, whether the case represents elaborate deception that fooled trained medical observers, or whether some combination of psychological disturbance, environmental factors, and coincidental circumstances created the appearance of impossible phenomena, and perhaps most hauntingly, what became of Eleanor Morrison herself. Whether she lived a normal life after leaving Philadelphia, whether her abilities or disturbances continued into adolescence and adulthood, whether she survived to old age carrying memories of those months when she arranged corpses in patterns she claimed the dead themselves desired, or whether her story ended in some unknown tragedy that left no historical record. Modern investigation attempts have been hampered by the destruction of many primary documents, with the Morrison Funeral Home's business records apparently lost when the building was converted to apartments, Thomas Morrison's personal diary existing only in fragmentary quotes preserved in Dr. Hartwell's papers, and the extensive photographic documentation mentioned in multiple accounts having disappeared from Philadelphia Police Department archives at some point before 1950, leaving contemporary researchers dependent on secondary sources and official reports that, while extensive, inevitably filtered the raw evidence through the interpretive frameworks of Victorian-era observers. What remains documented in archives, accessible to modern researchers, includes Dr. Hartwell's correspondence and notes housed at the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. The published report of the Medical Investigation Committee preserved in multiple medical libraries, newspaper accounts from Philadelphia papers between March and June of 1896, property transaction records showing the sale of the Morrison funeral home, and fragmentary references in the personal papers of other medical professionals who had peripheral involvement in the case. A documentary foundation sufficient to establish that something extraordinary was observed and recorded, but insufficient to determine with certainty what that something actually was, leaving the Morrison case suspended between documented historical event and inexplicable mystery. What can never be fully explained, regardless of theoretical framework or investigative approach, is the subjective experience of those who directly encountered Eleanor Morrison during those months in 1896, the sensation described by night watchman Robert Chen of hearing her voice in the preparation room speaking to silent corpses, the image preserved in Dr. Hartwell's memory of a 7-year-old child arranging adult bodies with casual familiarity, the sound recalled by Father Brennan of Eleanor's matter-of-fact descriptions of conversations with the deceased, and perhaps most profoundly, Thomas Morrison's desperate decision to abandon his established life and flee with his daughter into historical obscurity, rather than allow her continued examination by medical and religious authorities, a choice suggesting that whatever was happening to or through Eleanor transcended academic curiosity and touched something fundamental about parental protection in the face of forces beyond understanding. The Morrison case endures in medical and historical literature, not because it provides answers about the boundaries of human consciousness or the possibilities of childhood psychological phenomena, but rather because it documents with unusual thoroughness a set of observations that resist comfortable categorization, challenging the assumption that all historical mysteries must yield to sufficient investigation, and reminding us that some events, witnessed and recorded by credible observers, may forever occupy the uncomfortable space between documented fact and impossible occurrence. If you found this exploration of one of the most disturbing and thoroughly documented cases in Victorian medical history as compelling as I found it in researching the archives and contemporary accounts, please subscribe to this channel for more investigations into historical mysteries that challenge our understanding of what is possible, and leave a comment sharing your own thoughts on what might explain the phenomena observed in Philadelphia in 1896. Whether Eleanor Morrison possessed genuine abilities beyond current scientific understanding, or whether some more conventional explanation might account for everything that doctors, clergy, and ordinary witnesses claimed to observe in the basement of the Morrison funeral home during those extraordinary months over a century ago.